Well, welcome to another episode of the Scriptural Mormonism podcast. I'm your host, Robert Bollin. Today we are joined by a returning guest, my friend Swenson Bailey. Swenson, thanks for coming on to the podcast today.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.
Now, I will link to the episode you appeared on, episode 8, which was like quite a while ago now, on hell in Latter-day Saint theology. But for those who may not be familiar with yourself, how about you give an introduction to yourself?
So my name is Swenson Bailey. I'm from Arkansas in the USA, and I love it here. Woo Pig Sooie, right? We didn't beat BYU this year. We did last year. And it was kind of like we beat them on their home turf, and they came over here and beat us on our home turf. So it's not the best, but hopefully next year we'll show them what's up again. So, but I have a YouTube channel. It's It BOM. So Read It BOM. I post some videos on there sporadically when I have time. Some live stuff, but I also use that as a kind of place to put recordings of articles that I can't find audios for, so people can absorb those while they're driving or whatever. I put those on my YouTube channel that I think are interesting and that defend the faith. I've done some of Robert's stuff, so hopefully that's okay, but he's got some really good stuff out there. But if people don't read as much as listen as I do, I kind of give it the audio content.
Oh, that's good, and I'll link your YouTube page in the show notes for this. And speaking of YouTube, only a few days ago you appeared on the YouTube debate on the on Merlin Wilson's channel, The Gospel Truth, discussing debating the fall in the Book of Mormon with, I believe he's now Eastern Orthodox, Andrew Harrison, who's done some debates where he's embarrassed himself against Jacob Hansen and a few others on the Trinity. So how about you tell us, like, how did the debate come about?
Yeah, so I mean, I consider Andrew a friend. Me and him have talked back and forth for over a year, and so we're friendly with each other. We adamantly disagree with each other on things of, theology and religion, but it's good sparring back and forth. So we had talked. We've talked about many different topics, just, and usually it's a topic and we talk it out for like a week or two, and then we end up going on to something else. And so one of these topics was the fall. And I was like, obviously we believe in the necessity of the fall, this necessity in God's plan. And he obviously opposed that idea. And so before the debate, it was probably, 6 months before we decided to do a debate, we talked about that. And then one day it got brought back up, and he's like, "Hey, let's do a debate about this." And he invited me on to Marlin's channel, The Gospel Truth, which I've watched that for the past many years, and I really like it. And so yeah, it was a good opportunity. I took it. It was my first debate. I thought I did pretty well, and I thought it showed a decent side to both arguments. I think, which I guess I can get into this in a minute, but I think the position he was giving me before the debate 6 months was a little bit different than the position he gave me during the debate, which kind of threw me off a little bit. But we'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, I think he's a good guy. And yeah, he himself knows that it was kind of rough, his debate with Jacob Hansen. He said that was his first like real debate, and he said he got caught up a little bit in the cross, but he I believe he did a lot better in our debate as well.
So, how did you actually prepare for this debate? What sources did you read? How did you go about preparing yourself for the debate? Because it's not an easy topic. I just came out like a two-part debate with a friend of mine, Adam Stokes, on modalism, early Latter-day Saint Christology. And that took a lot of prep work. So, how did you prepare for the debate and so forth?
So to be honest, it's never like something you should take lightly, or it's never something easy. But because me and him had just like, it's a topic that we had sparred out so much, like I would say for this was maybe a couple, like 3 weeks or one time. I had a lot of ideas already fleshed out in my head. To prepare, I obviously read the main text in the Book of Mormon, 2 Nephi 2. I was going over Moses. But I also was studying some other Christian sources, right? Like what other people in Christianity, what other figures or religions or denominations somewhat agree with us. And I was trying to find some of those things to use to show that this wasn't an us versus them debate. but that it's a debate like, is the fall necessary, sort of a thing. So it wasn't too easy, but because we'd already sparred out a lot, I had my main ideas fleshed out. So I just started typing, and then as I went through my process of editing and getting more information from these other sources, I tied those into my arguments, and it worked its way out. I thought it was a decent opening statement and rebuttal.
Sure. So before we kind of discuss some of your arguments and so forth, like if someone were to ask you succinctly, what would be a theology of the fall in the Book of Mormon, particularly say 2 Nephi 2 and other texts, how would you respond?
So the theology of the fall in the Book of Mormon. Well, I mean, if we're sticking strictly to the Book of Mormon, the theology there seems to be that I think the one line that we can kind of skip over, but is really important. So everybody knows Adam felt that men might be and men are that they have joy, right? That may have joy. But the verse right before that says, and all things happen in the wisdom of him who knoweth all things, right? So I believe that's very important because it says that. And then also in 2 Nephi chapter 2, it says, and to bring about his eternal purposes in the end of man, God planted the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We also see that he let the devil in so that they could exercise their free will, because to have free will, they had to have enticings on both sides, that sort of a thing. So we see that the fall was, in a way, necessary in God's plan. It was in his wisdom that it happened, because this is my belief, the whole of 2 Nephi chapter 2 is to build up for the last couple verses, the last 4 verses, where it says, and the Messiah cometh in the fullness of time, and he redeemeth man from the fall. And because they're redeemed, they can choose eternal life through the great mediator of all men, or captivity and death through the captivity and power of the devil, right? So I believe everything's the build up for man to be able to choose. So that's kind of the theology. It's like, we believe the fall is necessary. They were able to have kids after the fall, and that brought about the ability for man to exercise our free will, choose Christ or not. So I would say that for me is the understanding of the theology of the fall in the Book of Mormon.
Okay, so how about you walk us through like some of what you consider to be the best arguments you used, or something that may have fallen onto the the editing floor, if you will. What do you think like some of the best scriptural and or patristic defenses a Latter-day Saint can present for this particular view of the fall that we have?
Let's see. We do need to make sure that we understand that classic Christianity, classic theology or theism, is coming from a couple different presuppositions than ours, but we still can have collusion, or we can still have points of agreement, right? And so I believe there are people out there who don't necessarily believe in a pre-existence, who don't have the understandings we do about the pre-existence, but they still agree with us in the necessity of the fall and why it was necessary. So, for example, I think I quoted pretty accurately Ambrose. I quoted pretty accurately Arthur Lovejoy, and because he wrote a whole thing about Milton and the paradox of the fortunate fall. And then John Wesley, he wrote a whole sermon. So those are historical figures that I believe we can actually quote and say, hey, these people are saying things that align up with what we're saying. Andrew tried to say that they didn't in the debate, but he didn't really exactly show necessarily why that was allowed to be said. But I believe a couple good arguments for us would be, because again, I tried to argue it from 2 ways, right? I tried to argue it saying you can't say that our belief in the fall being necessary is wrong, because in your position, like in your worldview, it makes sense that it's necessary. So that's how I argued it. Does that make sense? Like I went into their worldview and I said, hey, even in your worldview, it makes sense, and I would say more sense that it's necessary than not. So just looking at our worldview and saying, well, you say it's necessary, that's completely wrong. I kind of try to do away with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, basically, like even if you just hold like a simple foreknowledge view, like God just simply knows the future, he knew that the atonement would be a reality. So the question is like, at least in the logic of God's decree, as opposed to like anything temporal, if you believe, as I don't, God's outside of time completely. which one came first, or which one was decreed first, or which one was foreknown by God first. And it's rather clear, like in Peter and Revelation, Christ is the Lamb slain before the foundation of the world. So that must mean, was that the case in God's decree, but it came logically after the fall or before the fall? So there's like a host of other issues that I don't really think were really addressed by Andrew that really came out, because I don't really know too much about Eastern Orthodoxy on this particular point. I've studied the energies essence distinction, and I've seen their work in the papacy and a few other things like deification. So I could be mistaken. But I think they would actually agree that even if God did not desire for the fall to happen, like he decreed it in the Calvinistic sense, at the same time, he knew would happen because of his exhaustive foreknowledge and his planning and so forth, So he would still, as a top priority, still actually ordain the second person of the Trinity to actually become a sacrifice for us and participate in these energies, if you will, to basically paraphrase like Eastern Orthodox soteriology. So here's the thing, like, did a fall catch God by surprise? Well, you can't say that, especially if you hold to some type of classical theism, or even just like divine simplicity, not absolute divine simplicity as Eastern Orthodox would. They reject absolute divine simplicity. But there's like a couple of other things that really didn't come out. So he was saying, like, yeah, of course it's going to happen, but it was a necessity. But like, do you believe that, to use the technical term, superlapsarian incarnation, Christ would become incarnate even if the human race did not fall? And that kind of brings up some other issues as well. I don't think Eastern Orthodox would be wedded to that idea, but that's some things I thought of while listening to the debate.
Well, yeah, and so like that's the thing. When I've looked into Eastern Orthodoxy, right, and I've done so because talking to him a lot, and preparing for the debate, I was kind of looking into what they would say. And again, before the debate, we've sparred this out, and we did for like 3 weeks or so. Just sending we use like WhatsApp, and we send audios back and forth, like, hey, like, what about this? This is my response to that. What about this? That sort of thing. And so he presented the position of the fall is not necessary because Christ would have come beforehand, right? He kind of showed that position, and that is an Eastern Orthodox position. They kind of hold to that in their tradition. They have saints in the past who said that, and so they hold that view. And I've heard another Eastern Orthodox tell me that as well. But so they hold that view, and but in the debate he didn't really show that, right? In the debate, and afterwards, because we've spoken since, he said, yeah, that's the viewpoint I had, because I was like, your viewpoint kind of changed in the debate. He's like, no, I didn't change it. I just wasn't as forthcoming with my viewpoint as I need to be. And I kind of laughed out loud at that, because we were actually on a phone call, and I was like, yeah, well, come on now, because I was actually prepared for that argument, right? Because there's three things, and I didn't say this in the debate, because like having watched the debate again and speaking with him again afterwards, there's three things that come out that are a possibility, right? It's and this is from their perspective, right? So one is the Eastern Orthodox view, right? Which Christ would have come either way, right? Christ would have come without the fall or with the fall. He would have been incarnated, right? And why do they say that?
Christology, yeah.
And they say that because there's positives to the incarnation, right? So they're basically saying, and it would have had to work out like this. So Christ came because of the fall, but there's positives to the incarnation. So what happened if they didn't fall, right? We don't want to say that's necessary, because they don't want to say that. So, Christ would have had to come without the fall, right? That's how they work that out. So you can say that, or you can say, kind of as Protestants would, you can say, well, there's positives to the fall with the incarnation, but had they not fallen, then Christ wouldn't have come, and it would have been totally fine. We would have been, we wouldn't need those, right?
Yeah, and the justification for that is like the understanding of, say, the covenant that works in Calvinism. They're basically rank Pelagians when it comes to Adam. They believe Adam could have kept the law perfectly in the Garden of Eden. That was the covenant that works, and so forth.
Yeah, and so basically they say, yeah, there's positives to the fall in the incarnation with Christ, but had they not fallen, it would have been fine. Like, we don't even need those. And then the other position is what we hold, right? Which is, no, there's positives to the incarnation. Had the fall not happened, there would be no need for the incarnation. And so God wanted to bring about those positives in the incarnation, in Christ's infinite atonement. And so the fall was part of his plan to bring that about. right? That's where we would fall. So it's one of those three positions. And the reason Orthodox hold their position is because they realize it's weird to say the fall is necessary. We don't want to say that. So they worked this out in the past, but that's the position is, oh, he would have come anyway. Well, I was ready to rebut that, but as you said, it's kind of deceptive. He didn't present that fully. Instead, it ended up being in the debate when I rewatched it. I'm saying, well, is the fall necessary? And he's kind of like, well, that depends on what you mean. When he knew what I meant, is the fall is it a necessity that this happen in God's plan? And he's like, well, it's necessary for Christ to come, right? But in a way, he doesn't believe that. And because, we all know Christ came because we fell, but did that have to happen? Or what do he, again, it was a little deceptive. But
so imagine you were having a debate now and he did actually raise this idea. How would you respond?
And so, and so in my ending, my closing, I kind of brought it up myself. I was like, we don't believe in incarnation anyway. That's kind of like a layperson understanding of it, or way to talk about it. Incarnation anyway. And so basically how I would have rebutted that is saying, I would have went into his worldview. So in their worldview, the only way we know anything about God is through him revealing it, right? And so God has to reveal us scripture or something like that in order to know anything about his nature. And so Thomas Aquinas himself pointed out, and he said, because he rejected incarnation anyway, and he did so on these grounds that the only revelation we have about Christ basically is the tradition and is the scriptures. And God doesn't reveal about what ifs. He only reveals about what is. So therefore, nothing in the tradition or in the scripture could have told us if Christ would have become incarnate had they not fallen, because everything revealed is knowing he would fall and knowing he did fall, right? So therefore, saying to get out of the conundrum, oh, well, the fall's not necessary for Christ because he would have come beforehand, that's just a guess. There's no way to base that in scripture because everything we have is revealed knowing Adam did and would fall. So, that's how Thomas Aquinas kind of rejected that. And I believe that's a very valid argument in coming from a classic Christian worldview.
Yeah, although from my experience, Eastern Orthodox don't exactly like Aquinas for a number of reasons. But yeah, that would be say the traditional view. And I could be mistaken, but I believe Eastern Orthodoxy believes that God is completely outside of time. So when he was creating, he would have known what would have happened. So is his knowledge contingent or of necessity, and is exhaustive? That kind of brings up some of these other issues as well. And that was one of my arguments, and I don't think he really addressed it that much. One of my arguments was from creation, right? So in their worldview, from creation, it seems that God, who had limitless possibilities, right? And when you say that he has infinite possibilities of what he could create, then there is a world where he could have created where Adam and Eve would not have fallen, right? And then the question is, okay, well, in infinite possibilities, there is that possibility that they didn't fall. Why did he create this reality where they did fall? Especially when you creation out of nothing.
Exactly. Yeah. So let me explain this. And if you watch the debate in my cross, I start with that. I said, do you believe in the classic Christian worldview where God is outside of space, matter, and time, and he has no outside pressures, and he can create whatever he wants? And Andrew said yes. So coming from that premise, then the only logical conclusion you can make is that God created this world because it brought about his will, the best, right? So God's nature to them, he is perfectly good, right? And he can't go against his nature, and he can't go against his will. So any creation that he would have made had to be the best creation that would have brought about his will. And so he brought about this reality knowing perfectly that they would fall. And so it just kind of makes sense that by necessity, the best reality for God to create was for man to fall so Christ could become incarnate and save us, right? And that's that goes along with what we believe. We believe we're in the best world because falling is part of this world, right? It's part of God's plan to bring about Christ and the best reality through Christ.
Sure, and just let's just share my screen here. Just with respect to, say, the text from 1 Peter that speaks of how Christ was foreordained before the foundation of the world. This is what one, I believe he's a Protestant scholar, said about this. The primary intent of the verse, however, it originated, is to link the death of Christ to God's eternal plan, thus removing it from the realm of the accidental. while the question of whether events were due to accident on the one hand or the fate or will of the gods on the other was present in the Greco-Roman philosophy of that period. It is doubtful that such debate motivated the inclusion of this material here. Its origin lies more probably in those Jewish traditions, which maintain that the divine plan of salvation underlying world events was laid down before creation, an idea whose appropriation is also evident elsewhere in early Christian tradition. And the passive voice of the two participles indicates that all of this is God's doing, adds further assurance to the claim that the redemption brought about by the death of Jesus is reliable precisely because it was due to the divine initiative. So that's something like a Latter-day Saint would agree completely with respect to your understanding of like the fall and so forth. But it would engage like a lot of special pleading from Andrew Harrison and others when it comes to, well, it kind of depends on what you mean by necessity. You know, it was God's plan. So does that mean that the incarnation could have been thwarted? Or at least the atonement and the salvific resurrection of Christ and so forth could be thwarted in God's plan, not simply an incarnation of the Son of God or the second member of the Trinity, either way. And that kind of brings up like some issues about like exegesis and so forth.
Yeah. Well, there was something else I wanted to point out. But yeah, so I think that the problem from creation is very important. And what you were bringing up, quoting kind of like how it says, from the foundation of the world, we're going to be saved through Christ. It says we're going to be made blameless, right, through Christ. You can't be made blameless unless you have blame on you. You know what I mean?
I'm thinking like doing the cross-ex. Andrew was kind of equivocating about like the status of Adam and Eve before and after the fall. Like, you know, were they righteous? Well, there's different understandings of righteous. Like there could be like a moral righteousness, and then there's a salvific righteousness. So there was quite a bit of equivocation when it comes to these like various terms. You know, you could refer to like, say, Cornelius was before his conversion seen as like a righteous man, but he wasn't righteous in the sense he was justified by God and so forth. He had to be regenerated and baptized, and that's kind of, it's not one-to-one equivalent, but it does kind of show like there was equivocation when it comes to these particular terms. That's why I remember doing some of these cross-ex.
Yeah, and so something that they like to point out, or they try to brush away, is when we say plan A, plan B, right? And he tried to do that too, and he's like, oh, they say plan A, plan B, but that's not how it is, right? They said God's only plan was for us always to be saved through Christ, because he foreknew that Christ would fall, right? So whenever we say plan A, plan B, they're like, that's not how it is, but yet they speak as if that's how it is, because they say, well, Adam could have stayed in the garden, and he should have stayed in the garden, but he fell, right? So that shows that there's a preferred plan by God, and then there's a plan that was not preferred, but was pursued by God. You know what I mean? So it kind of shows a division in the plans, but yet when we say that, they're like, no, God's foreknowledge doesn't allow that. And you know what I mean? It's kind of semantics, but it's very important to point out there's a preferred plan. You can't say it's not, otherwise, you know, then we're right, because this was God's plan that Christ come, be incarnated, as we said.
Sure. So what do you think are like some of the strongest arguments he raised against the Latter-day Saint position?
So I might get some flack for this, but I think when you, and I said this in the debate, I think when you believe in your theology that the fall was necessary, then I think there can be some things that are some conclusions or some sort of rationalities that can be made or thought up that people can take hold of and say, yes, this makes sense. So in his debate, he tried to argue against some of those rationales I would say a lot of members of the church have that I don't necessarily have, right? He tried to argue saying like, some people don't call it a sin, they only call it a transgression or a part sin or half a sin or something like that. He tried to talk about how he tried to like kind of pin in and say, well, the only thing you can believe is that Adam in the pre-existence said, I'm going to sin for you, God, which he said that makes issues, right? And so I believe these are valid arguments if you are upholding those presuppositions or those beliefs. But as I was in the debate, I don't see those in our scripture. I don't see those in the revealed text saying from the Lord that, hey, Adam said to God, I'm going to sin for you. Like, I don't see anything like that in our scripture and revealed truth. So therefore, I don't hold those positions. And when I did that, it was, I think it was hard for him to necessarily rebut everything I was saying, because I wasn't coming at it as other LDS would. And so I think
basically he was attacking a straw man, a popular one, but still a straw man.
Yes, he was something that wasn't necessarily true or precisely true, but people in our church do uphold. So I think it's okay for us to question some things like that, right? For example, I don't also hold that Eve knew she should fall, right? Our scriptures actually say it was afterwards that she realized, hey, had we not fallen, we wouldn't have kids, right? She realized that after that, but not before. That's in Moses, right? And so I think it's okay to, and he was attacking those things, like, hey, you believe that Adam said he would sin for God, or you believe that Eve knew she had to fall, so she was doing that. Or one he really tried to argue was, you believe in conflicting commandments, that God set these two commandments to conflict necessarily so that they would fall. And yes, I've heard all of those by church members, but those aren't necessarily what the restored gospel is teaching, right? Those are, again, because we believe the fall is necessary, people have made some rationalities, and I think a lot of those have been caught on by a lot of church members, and they hold to those. But I don't think it's necessarily true for us to have to believe those, or I don't even think a lot of those are taught in our revealed truth.
Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen. This is actually from section 29 of the Doctrine and Covenants, so like it's a very early revelation, and actually has a very low view of Adam and the fall here. It says like, Adam, your father, I gave unto him that he should be an agent in themselves. Speaks of Adam being tempted of the devil. He partook of the forbidden fruit and transgressed the commandment, wherein he became subject to the will of the devil and yielded unto temptation. He became spiritually dead, which is the first death, even that same death, which is the last death, which is spiritual, which shall be pronounced upon the wicked when I say, depart ye cursed. So Adam was translated like from a state of like maybe original innocence and so forth to like say basically condemnation. It wasn't exactly like a very good thing. And that kind of comes out like in Latter-day Saint theology. If you go beyond 2 Nephi chapter 2 in the Book of Mormon to like various discussions about the fall and how we become kernels as a result of it, it's not exactly like a joyous thing like some Latter-day Saints mistakenly think. It was a tragedy, but at the same time, it resulted in, like, say, a greater good, that is no longer being in a state of original innocence and so forth. It's been participating in the life of Christ, the idea of Christification and so forth, that could not come about unless, of course, of necessity, the fall happened. And he kind of mentioned, and we won't be able to go into this, but, is there a fall in every world? I'm not sure if he raised it or someone doing the audience Q&A raised it. But on the show notes, I'll include a link to my friend Jeff Bradshaw's discussion about this. He argues, and I think he's correct, this is the only world where there would have been a fall. And he kind of presents a very good case that there hasn't been a fall in every world. Now, if you want holds like Adam, God, and to some degree Brigham Young's, and especially the fundamentalists understand like there has to be a fall in every world and so forth, yeah, that's a problem. But in official Latter-day Saint theology, that's not of necessity, and I don't think that's the case as well. But everyone should check out Jeff Bradshaw's discussion about it. It's only about 2 pages, but it's pretty good. He kind of shows like it's not a necessity to believe there's a fall in every world.
Well, I definitely want to check that out because, that was an interesting question. I wasn't expecting someone to raise that, and yeah, that's quite interesting. Now, something that I kind of saw recently is in Moses. It does talk about worlds and the inhabitants thereof. So that is a valid question, right? Like what about these other worlds? Do they all have falls? So I'm looking forward to, and again, that's another presupposition that I think that argument, that question is going against is that's like you said, Adam God, or that is an infinite regression of divinity. If we hold to those beliefs that people have in the church, then that kind of sounds like, oh, well, you have to have fall after fall, and you have to have salvation after salvation. And, I don't necessarily agree with that. And so when I don't agree with that, I don't think that is a very strong attack against what I'm trying to uphold.
Yeah, because like in our Latter-day Saint soteriology, presenting like some of these other debates we have internal to us, Christ redeemed not just this world, but like worlds without number. You see this in section 76 of Doctrine and Covenants. You also see this in William Wines Phelps' poetic rendition of what is now section 76 as well. That also reproduces that idea. and even like in the most hardline Adam God ideas, like, well, God, Jesus redeemed not just this world but other worlds in this multiverse view. I should write a monograph someday on Adam God and so forth. But until then, check out the B.H. Roberts Foundation website, where we have we'll be republishing with some editing, but close to like 1,000 sources on Adam God related topics. So yeah, that was something that came out in the debate.
Before I just want to be able to, because I don't know if everyone's going to go and watch the debate. They might not want to. There are some things I'd like to share some of the quotes I shared during the debate that I felt were Christians, right? Trinitarians who were agreeing and like lining up very well with our beliefs.
Go ahead.
Would that be okay?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I'm just pulling up my opener. So one, something he told me is that he felt like I was a little bit deceptive with quoting the Catholic Exalted, right? So it is true. I understand that the Catholic Church does not teach a necessity of the fall as we do, but I believe that their song, their Easter Vigil mass or song, which was inspired by Ambrose, is very interesting. So it says, "O truly necessary sin of Adam, destroyed completely by the death of Christ. O happy fault that earned so great, so glorious a Redeemer." Right? So I think it's interesting that if you hold to Aquinas, which a lot of Catholics do, then there would be no necessity of a incarnation without the fall. But it was only with the fall and it being necessary that we got the incarnation. But the Exalted is influenced by Ambrose. And one thing that Ambrose said right here says, "I thank the Lord our God who created such a marvelous work in which to find his rest. I read he created man, and that at this point he rested, having a being whose sins he could forgive." So I find that very interesting that Ambrose is saying that God created man because he wanted to be able to forgive their sins.
And Ambrose is no randomer from like the 4th century. We're talking about like he's a canonized saint in the Catholic tradition, perhaps also in the Eastern tradition. At least I would say he's either a saint or blessed at the very least. He also influenced Augustine, who's one of the leading theologians of Christian history, for better or worse, and I would say largely worse. But, so we're not talking about some randomer. He's also a doctor of the Catholic Church, I believe. So, the East and West, even if the East would disagree with some of these views, would say this is like a pretty heavy hitter when it comes to, say, sacramental theology and other topics as well. Mm-hmm. He's not some randomer you came across on like Reddit or YouTube or something like that.
Yeah, it's not like one person that we have one document, from them and, hey, there's this one saint and he said this. No, it's not like that.
Sure.
So another thing he said is evil, in fact, has a utility within itself, and evil has even insinuated itself into the saints by the providential will of the Lord. So again, I feel like that aligns more with us than it would with other denominations, right? Then there's Giacomo Biffi, who was a former archbishop in the Catholic Church, and he taught, because he was a scholar on Ambrose, he taught sin has its own valuable, positive character in God's plan. I feel like that's very, very telling. And then he said that according to Ambrose, God creates the universe for man, creates man in order to be merciful. It cannot be said that he creates man as a sinner or in order that he should sin, but it must be certainly said that the ultimate rest of Christ in his redemptive death and manifestation of divine mercy represent the ultimate and highest meaning of creation. So I think that is a very powerful quote. And this is, coming from a Catholic archbishop, someone who studied Ambrose a lot. He's saying Ambrose is saying that, as we would, God created the universe for man, and then he didn't create us that we should sin. But the thing is, Christ's death is the highest, his sacrifice, his atonement. That's the highest meaning of creation, right? That's what we believe, right? The plan of salvation, everything before it points to his atonement, and everything after it points back to it, right?
Sure.
So,
and it doesn't seem like you can fit like a supernapsarian incarnation into that as well, i.e., like Christ would be an incarnate, even if the fall didn't happen, because in that view, especially if you hold like say later ADS or absolute divine simplicity view, it was a necessity anyway.
Exactly.
Even if you want to define necessity differently than say how a Latter-day Saint would when it comes to the order of God's decree, to use that term.
And then the last thing, I just invite everybody to go and read what was it called? I think it's God's Love for Fallen Man. It's a sermon by John Wesley, and it's the one I quoted. And he talks about how if Adam had not fallen, Christ had not died. Right? It talks about how there would have been no such thing as faith in God, thus loving the world. Right? That's a very important fact. Right? We would never have known how much, like John 3:16, that wouldn't exist without the fall. Man would never have known how much God could have loved us had we not actually fallen and see what he did for us, right? Giving his only begotten son. He also said that had there been neither natural nor moral evil, which evil is because of the fall, in the world, what must have become of patience, meekness, gentleness, long suffering? It is manifest that they could have had no being. So this is a very Latter-day Saint thought that because of the fall, we can obtain these attributes: patience, meekness, gentleness, long suffering. Without the fall, we wouldn't get those. And in the Bible, we see that we're told to get those. We're told to be patient, right? We're told to be meek. But we only get those because we live in a world where we can learn and grow and say, hey, we want to push off evil, right? Or I need to be patient when things happen to me that are bad or that I don't like. In the fall, it's a different reality. Or before the fall, it's a different reality. There would never be something pushing on us to learn to be patient.
Well, that's good. It's just like because you were quoting Ambrose, he's a Catholic saint. This is a book I read not too long ago, The Seven Sacraments of the Catholic Church by Romanus Casario. The Happy Fault. The sacraments of the new law enjoy an objective efficacy based on the supreme work of Christ. The word objective in this context points to the power of God at work in the sacramental action. The Catechism quotes Aquinas, who writes that the sacraments is not wrought by the righteousness of either the celebrant or recipient, but by the power of God. Further clarifications are required in order to understand how properly the sacraments work, as it were, objectively. Obviously, any suggestion of magic or superstition remains out of place. Instead, the sacraments of the new law figure in the work of image restoration, image perfection, categories that represent God's twofold justified action in the sinner. Detachment from sin and the sanctification of the human person, both body and soul, require that the Christian believer properly understand the providence of God as it pertains to divine permission for man's sin. As with Adam's sin, the sins of his progeny always can become expressions of a felix culpa, a fortunate fall, inasmuch as the sacraments of the new law exist to restore people to friendship with Christ. That not only exceeds, obviously, the state of sin, but also exceeds whatever natural happiness a person may discover in this world. So it's not just simply a restoration to the natural happiness or the natural innocence in Eden. It's a restoration, but it's all the more so in Latin theology, and I'm sure it's also the same in Eastern Orthodox theology as well.
Well, it is, right? Because their whole thing is Eastern Orthodoxy holds even so much more so to theosis than the West does, right? And so their whole thing about theosis is God became man, and now man can become God, right? Because of the incarnation, we can go through theosis, and so that's why, again, in their theology, they had to have Christ being able to come without the fall, because then, well, God created this being, and he can't become. He's not already created like God, or he's not already gone through that process of theosis. So therefore, there has to still be that incarnation, right? And so this is the main point why I believe the fall is necessary, even in their worldview, because one, it's just a guess that Christ would have come without the fall. They can't state that, right? And two, like all the benefits that we get from Christ through the fall, we just have to say, well, God wouldn't have given us, just didn't want to give those to man, right? If they hadn't fallen, which is a very weird view to take. So for us to say, no, the fall was actually it was negative because it was a fall, but it was a step forward, right? I mean, said that in debate because it brought about God's will in the end of man. That's very important. So Andrew in the debate, he kept trying to press, well, it's never necessary to disobey God, right? But he was trying to push that in the view of, we believe that Adam willingly disobeyed. And I don't concede that. I don't think that we actually believe that. And I was pushing against that.
Section 29 of Doctrine and Covenants and other sources indicate that's not the case. And one can only guess what his pre-mortal knowledge of this would have been. So, I mean, I don't think any Latter-day Saints. That's what I was pointing out. For instance, I don't think there's any there might be, but I don't think there's any Latter-day Saint, hopefully, out there who thinks in the pre-existence Judas said, yeah, I'll betray the Son of God. So
that'll be hard, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to go with Satan right now or Lucifer. I don't want to rebel now. I'll just wait until I'm in life and then I'll do it. Yeah, you know what I mean? That's what we would have to say that Judas was willing to do. You know what I mean? So that's actually a very good defense. I didn't think about that.
Yeah, and also like
But
there's kind of begs the question, like, some events, like say Christ would die and be raised again, that could be like a necessity. But like how they come about, there could be contingencies attached to that as well. So there's like I'm not sure about you, but like I would hold like say dynamic omniscience or open theistic view, so that would kind of fit out nicely with what I believe. But there's other nuances and other ideas that didn't really come out during the debate. If you think it's necessity, that means everything attached to it had to happen in the same way, and there's no guilt or blame if one is consistent. There was like a bunch of problems I thought throughout the arguments against not really same position.
yeah, about open theism, I'm like halfway there. I'm halfway convinced, sort of a thing. Hearing a lot of stuff that you've done on your channel and talked about it with open theists of, but yeah, about the whole what we were just talking about. How to state it. About the whole idea that the whole idea that he was going against the straw man, or it's not something that we necessarily believe, but he was going against the idea that Adam basically said, "I'll sin for you," right? I brought up, I was like, so basically, like we don't know that, as you said, that's a guess. You're guessing that Adam had to say that, and basically, I was saying, so that Moses told to the Hebrews, right? I don't know if you would agree with this, but I use this as an example in the debate, which he didn't really respond to. But Moses told to the Hebrews, "Hey, when you cross over the Jordan, your kids are going to go, you're going to have kids, and they're going to go whoring after other gods, right? They're going to become wicked and do stuff." But yet the Hebrews, they crossed over the Jordan and they still had kids. And so the question is, were they consenting? Were they okay with that disobedience? Because it's, quote unquote, as he would say, never okay to disobey God. And so we would have to say that they were held guilty for what their kids did with their free will. And I would say, no, that's not okay. And that's basically what that we believe in the pre-existence. God said, "Hey, you're going to go down and there's going to be sin," right? He didn't say go down and sin for me. All we can know is he probably advised them, "Hey, there's going to be separation, there's going to be sin, but with Christ, everything's going to be made right."
Yeah, there's a difference between like telling someone based on their foreknowledge of events and saying, commanding them to do such. A prophet could predict like so and so is going to blow up a museum tomorrow. That doesn't mean like he's okay now. He's just like prognosticating the future. And again, there's category errors going on here from what I can perceive.
Yeah. Real quick, what did you? I'm kind of changing topics. What did you think about his whole idea of children before the fall? Right. So against us, he was kind of like, again, he was going against the idea that it's conflicting commandments or whatever. But he's like, you believe that God was that Adam and Eve, or you had to believe that Adam and Eve were sinning by not having kids before the fall, because they were told to have kids before the fall. So they were sinning because they didn't, and then they had to do that. They had to sin again, and then they weren't sinning because they could have kids. So he had this whole idea, and then I told him, well, then that would turn on you and your understanding because you don't believe they had kids. At least I don't think you do. And he's like, well, no, they had kids, right? Which I thought was very interesting, because where do we see that? Like, at most, that's just an assumption, and that's just an assumption to walk away from that argument and not have to answer that for yourself, I think.
Yeah, I mean, like Genesis 3:16 could be read like either way. It's ambiguous. It could be either you have the ability to give engage in childbirth, but now your pains will be multiplied, or it could just be like an example of Hebrew poetry saying like, now your pains will be great, in childbearing. Also, one could argue there's a solace, but like one could argue from just because something an argument from silence can actually be in some sense like evidence of something. And here's the thing: we're told like the characters who are condemned, Adam, Eve, and the serpent in Genesis 3. There's no mention of the other kids. Now you could hold it like say, well, they were the federal head, and Eve is condemned because Adam was her federal head. But what about the other recipients of this punishment? You would imagine that they would be included in like various curses as well, like Adam, Eve, and like to your children as well, blah blah blah. So, and also like in their theology, they could have had kids biologically speaking. It's just like because they were in a state of innocence, they just didn't know how to go about it. I'm trying to keep this like very PG-13 here. So there's like a couple of things, and like if you look at like say various Christian and Jewish academic and historical commentaries on Genesis 3:16. You'll have some who argue they could have had kids. You'll have some who argued it's at that moment they could have kids, and you could have some who said, and there's other positions as well. So trying to like focus on like say what is in Hebrew like a poetic rendition of a curse, and trying to read back into like a systematic theology of Adam, Eve before fall and their family dynamics. I mean, I'm not saying the biblical text doesn't refute it, but at the same time, it's kind of precarious to like put all your eggs into that curtain, if you will.
Yeah. So,
but like for those who want to say your sources on this, go on the Sefaria website. You'll find some commentators who said they take a very literal view of Genesis 3:16, and some will nuance it to the point where they say it's only at this point they actually can have kids. And if you look at various commentaries on the Hebrew as well, it's not as clear cut as some believe it to be. Because like in our view, like they could have had kids, and there would be like some kind of if they did have kids, they weren't in that state of innocence before the fall. There would be like maybe some discomfort at the very least when it comes to childbearing. We don't know, but it would be multiplied anyway as a result of the fall. So I don't really think it's as clear cut against our theology or in support of the traditional view as well. And of course, like we're the kids, we're told about Cain and Abel and so forth in Genesis, but we're not told anything about their status in the opening chapters of Genesis. And again, that doesn't prove anything one way or another, but at the same time, if one is going to argue based on Solomon, it would support our view because, again, the characters here condemned, it's not simply Adam and as a result, everyone under his federal headship. It's Adam, Eve, and of course the serpent. He was influenced by Satan. So, one could argue from that as well. Not definitively, but at the same time, there could be something there to it as well.
Well, I mean, and so I don't know if you could say this is a 1-for-1, but then like that kind of shows that God is trying to judge differently, right? Because we understand that even Christians mainstream Christians would say in the Bible, they would say before the creation of Eve, Adam and Eve in the garden, they would say there was already a judgment of the angels, right? There were rebelling and casting out of Lucifer and his group, but not all angels fell because Lucifer rebelled, right? Like, and maybe they said, well, he wasn't the head, but he was a very high member, and he was kicked out with his followers, but yet apparently God decides to change the rules for humanity, and there's more than just Adam and Eve, but they're the head, and so when one of them does something, it's going to affect everybody. But yet on earth, it's not like that, right? One person saved by Christ, now everyone's saved. It's not like that. It's different now, right? So it just kind of shows a God who doesn't change, him changing how he judges. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, it's not how I would go about it because, like, kind of brings up, like, say, when was the fall of the angels with respect to the fall of man, and you'll actually have various views about that topic, and that we kind of bring up like some speculation when it comes to say outside of Latter-day Saint tradition. But yeah, that's kind of interesting. Any other, before we end things, like any other highlights from the debate that you would want to highlight for anyone who might consider watching it?
Well, I mean, just consider watching it. I think it was very interesting. I think let's see, any other highlights. So I did have a couple of things that I brought up about. Oh, yes, let's talk about this real quick. So there were two things that Andrew brought up, and I think, and he kind of presented them to me as, wow, these are actually, these are two hard hitting issues that I see in Book of Mormon and LDS theology. So I want your response to them. And in my rebuttal, I didn't have time. One of them, I told him, hey, ask me in cross-ex, I'll respond. And the other one, I didn't have time to get to, and I said the same thing. But neither of them got brought up later. But like later on in the Q&A, he kind of like brought it up, but I hadn't had a chance to respond to it. So one of them was the idea that the Book of Mormon in 2 Nephi 2 teaches that God's existence is dependent on the existence of sin, right? He basically said that for God to exist, there has to be sin, because he's like, if there's no sin, there's no righteousness. If there's no righteousness, there's no this, no this. And then it says God is not, right? Do you remember those verses in 2 Nephi chapter 2?
Yeah, but it seems to be just talking about, like, say, mortality and so forth. But yeah.
I mean, that's how I would say it, right? So basically, just to kind of give my response to that, I think that's a hypercritical reading of the text, right? And in preparing for the debate, I saw some Protestant person who had written a paper about, like, trying to say that LDS people believe this, which we don't. And so I would say basically, we would all say that we can say what is right and what is wrong, right? We know what truth is because God exists, right? And I think a Christian can say that too, right? More so in their theology. They say that truth is dependent on God. So if they're speaking to an atheist and they say, well, you know, we can say what's right or wrong, and the atheist says, well, there is no God, well, then they say, well, then there is no truth. And you can't have any moral sense of what is right or what is wrong. A Christian can say that to an atheist, right? But then if they're in the conversation, they say, well, there is no God, or there is no truth, then they cannot turn around and say, well, there is no God, right? So my point in saying that is the truth is dependent on God, not God on the truth, right? And so I think it's the same sort of thing to answer that in the Book of Mormon. Righteousness, sin, all these things are dependent on God's existence, right? So where there's God, he's going to put forth the law, and where there's law, there's either righteousness or sin. It's not, oh, well, you have to have sin to have God, right? So the Book of Mormon's not saying that. It's like you're saying immortality for us, God's organized us. He's sent us here on earth, and he's given us a law. So there's sin and there's righteousness because he's set forth laws. And so if we say there's no God, then there's none of those things. And if we say there's none of those things, then we're saying that God's not, right? But that's not actually true. So we basically, it's saying we can't say there's not a right or not a wrong, because if we do that, we say there's no God, but then there's no creation and we're not here, right? So it's just Lehi walking down the necessity to say God exists, so therefore there's a right and there's a wrong. That's basically all he's saying. That's how I'd answer that. Hopefully that made sense.
Sure. And was there a second topic you didn't have time to get to?
Yes, real quick. It is, he tried to bring up how that the members of the Godhead, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, that these three, they didn't need to be divine. They don't need to come through mortality. They don't need to come through fall, that sort of thing. And so he said, because basically we believe that we're ontologically similar or the same type of being as they are, just not not divine. He said it's inconsistent because we believe that we have to fall or come to a fallen world, and they didn't have to. So I kind of have a response to that, but how would you respond if you had to, a quick little response? Because I don't think that's as big of a hitter as kind of he was kind of making it out to be.
Yeah, like I know Ron Rhodes and Marion Bodine bring up that type of argument in your book from 1995, reasoning from the scriptures of the Mormons. So it's kind of popular. Firstly, there's qualitative differences between us and the members of the Godhead. So, just because something is a rule for us or like an expectation for us doesn't mean ipso facto it's a result for them. And also, like in our theology, at least Joseph Smith's theology, the Father experienced mortality, to gain experiential knowledge of mortality and so forth. You see this in the Kinfold Discourse. Regardless of like your views on, like, say, infinite regression of gods, or the view I would hold, like kinship monotheism. And there is like a tradition, although it's not really well defined, that the Holy Ghost, like Christ, will become incarnate sometime. Not that it requires like for him to be God to become such, but like for him to like gain greater perfection and experiential knowledge like the Son did. And again, if you go with the Kinfold Discourse, the Father did. But again, there's quality differences between us and the members of the Godhead. So, it's not like a rule set forth for them, because again, if you look at Abraham and so forth, like the different gradations of intelligences and so forth, it's not really an issue for our theology in terms of, say, consistency and so forth, once you nuance things.
Yeah, and so that's basically what my response was going to be, was there are differences between us and them, right? So going with the kind of like the kingship monotheism idea, we would say that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, as long as eternity passed, right, as long as they had the opportunity to make it, they were always one. But yet we weren't. We have not always made that decision with them, and because they are somehow in that, let's say, maturity or in that ability to make that, and we're not, well, we can't just change, right? There is no ability to become better or lesser really in the pre-existence, right? So that's what I would say. And so we're not a seed, right? That the idea that he's bringing up says, well, if you just plant us and we sit there, then we're going to grow into a tree. But that's, we're to grow into a God. That's not what we believe, right? We believe there's a necessity for us to through Christ have him help us change our nature, because he is different than we are in a way. He was able to do something in the pre-existence that we couldn't. That's kind of how I would, if you think that's a good answer, that's how I would do it.
Before we wrap things up, any other final comments or like any forthcoming debates or any other projects you're working on?
No, I'm not planning on becoming a huge debater. I wanted to do at least once. I thought it turned out pretty well. So just whenever I get a chance, I upload to my YouTube channel. So go over there and see what I've done. I've answered a couple questions that are common to the church and stuff, and yeah, that's about it.
No, as I said, I'll link the debate in the show notes alongside the article at my blog where I reproduce what Jeff Bradshaw said about falls and other worlds, as well as your YouTube channel as well. But Swenson, thanks again for joining us today, and all the best with any future endeavor you have.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Welcome.